Update 33.2 is here for the Lord of the Rings Online and does have a few exciting things to go over. So the bigger things are going to be the new race and class combinations, as well as the Minstrel class revamp and a whole lot of PvMP changes. So we'll get into some of the details with that, but first off we do have to go over the new class and race combinations. So with the Dwarves and Stoudex Dwarves, you can be a Captain and Warden. That does mean the Dwarden is here, and I'm excited to make some Dwarden content coming up. We also have Elves and High Elves can be Burglars, which also means that High Elves can be every single class except Beorning, of course. And then Hobbits can be Champions and Lore Masters. Let me know your all's thoughts on that particular combination. And finally, we have Race of Man can be Runekeepers. So overall, there are just a lot more options and flexibility between which race you want to be and which class you can be. Now, in the patch notes, they do point out for the events that we'll have the Harvest Math Festival, and they do have new cosmetic items coming with that. That does not start for a while, though. October 12th is going to be the start date. And now that we are at the classes section, I will point out there are a few minor changes to various classes here, but of course the big focus is on the Minstrel Revamp. So there are a lot of things going on with the Minstrel, and at its core the revamp is removing the yellow line specialization, as in you can't specialize into it, but you will still have traits in the yellow line tree, kind of like the Brawler class. So when you spec into the red or blue line, you can put points into the yellow line, and those traits are supposed to be supplemental to your build. With the Minstrel specifically, you might find some things to boost your healing, you might also find some other things to boost your damage, or give you a little bit of a more supportive role in whatever role you are playing. And then as far as gameplay changes, there aren't quite as many or quite as significant changes. You will probably notice a little bit of a rebalance with both your healing and damage skills. I know a lot of the damage skills have been overall buffed, but as far as gameplay goes, one of the bigger changes is going to be to the, not necessarily the ballad system itself, but the anthem and coda system. So codas will still function as, you can probably think of it as the capstone song of the Minstrel gameplay, but with the anthems, those are actually going to now have a shared cooldown. You will not be able to use them out of combat, and their durations have been greatly reduced, at least at a baseline level. There are still ways with like legendary items and some traits to improve the duration, and I think even reduce the cooldown. So there are still some ways to change that, of course, but at a baseline level, there's some significant changes there. So at the baseline level, for example, you will only be able to keep up one anthem at a time, and then you'll have some more resources to eventually start keeping up more anthems at once. There is also going to be the split of anthems into lesser anthems and greater anthems. So there are going to be 3 pairs of anthems. You have 3 lesser anthems and then 3 corresponding greater anthems. And there's a lot of complexity going on here, because when you use both a lesser and greater anthem, you get this pair effect, which will be a single buff on not only yourself, but anthems of course affect your fellowship members. So finally, after that, you can use any of the anthems, and that will refresh the paired anthem buff. So of course with that, there are going to be new anthems, and the way the anthems are structured is if you spec into the blue line, you get 1 anthem, and there will be a trait with a corresponding greater anthem. And similar with the red line, if you spec into the red line, there's a lesser anthem just for specking in, and you get the corresponding greater anthem as a trait. And finally with the yellow line, both the lesser anthem and greater anthem are traits, which you can get either as a red or blue line Minstrel. So I focus on those because those are some of the bigger changes coming to Minstrel, and some things you will have to probably adjust to when you start playing the Minstrel again after this update. Another thing I do want to highlight, and the last thing really to point out as far as these big scale changes go, is going to be the melody stance. So with Minstrel you have War Speech, or rather Dissonance stance, the DPS stance. You also have whatever the healing one is called, I think Resonance. And then you have this melody stance. So the way Standing Stone Games thought of this is the melody stance was kind of underutilized. It had themes of both damage and healing, but it was not particularly great at either of those. So now they're going to make it more of a supportive type stance and have things like debuffs within it. And not only debuffs, there will be more general like supportive elements, but also more utility coming in the melody stance. So hopefully Minstrels have a little bit more reason to go into it. But of course, with all these changes, we will have to see, and it's great if players of course give feedback on how they they think these changes went to Minstrel, and that's particularly important because Standing Stone Games has said they're going to pay attention to all the changes with the Minstrel. They're going to pay attention to the feedback players give them and consider how the Minstrel Revamp goes for possible changes similar to what the Minstrel is getting with future classes, such as removing a specialization and making whatever spec they remove to be just supplemental traits instead. So as far as the rest of the Minstrel changes go, I encourage you to check out the patch notes, and I will of course get to playing the Minstrel, probably my first time playing after this update goes live, so we will get an actual chance to dive into the gameplay in more detail than just this news video. Now for some other changes, we do need to get to the quest instances and adventures area section here, and something of note for people playing at the level cap in Gundabad, the two public instances, Lofts and Forge, will no longer give, the mobs there at least will no longer give you XP, currency, and loot. That's very sad because of course those mobs are like valuable. To me it makes it a little bit more rewarding to go into those and kill the enemies, but that will no longer be the case. It sounds like the rewards for the quests themselves will give item XP and other rewards to compensate, but we're still losing out on all that loot and the such, just to point out, so we'll see how that goes. And on a similar note to XP, focusing on item XP and particularly the legendary item reward track. So one of the problems that I have with the reward track is the lack of clarity. The game does not do a good job giving you information about it. It just says when you do something that gives you legendary item XP, it just says progress has been given to your reward track or whatever it says. And there's no detail given to the player about how much whatever content you are doing, if you're just killing a mob or turning in a quest, the game gives you no indication of how much that actually progresses your reward track, and this becomes important when you consider that the amount of progress you get in the reward track per item XP actually depends on your character level. So as they have in these patch notes here, they discovered an error with that across the various levels, and they have now made adjustments to the curve. So overall, what you should notice is between levels 45 and 140, basically as soon as you can start getting the reward track, assuming you have your legendary items, you should notice a smoother amount of reward track progress as you level your characters. But the reason I focus on this lack of clarity is this is something that's really hard for us players to see in the game without a whole lot of testing. So theoretically, with the system, a level 140 character doing a level 140 quest should get the exact same amount of reward track progress as a level 60 character doing a level 60 quest, but without the clarity in the system to actually indicate that, there's no way of players knowing that without a whole lot of testing. So ultimately, these changes might see a little bit of a change in optimization if you're looking to really farm that reward track XP, and for particular level ranges, it looks like a lot of the lower levels have had the XP requirement reduced to advance the reward track. So if you are a lower level character, you should notice that the reward track advances faster ultimately, and for level 130 to 131 rather to 140 characters, it will be the same as before, but they say in future seasons you'll likely increase the requirement for levels 131 and higher, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, despite my long-winded rant here, I do want to point out that I think this is good that the progression will be smoother across the different level ranges, and hopefully players can actually feel that in their progression. And finally, we get to the PvMP changes. Now, there's a ton of stuff going on here. The developer who has been, at least one of the developers who has been working on it, Orion, has been great about communicating these changes, and there have been a whole bunch of threads on the forums. He's also been active on some Discord servers with more direct communication to players. So for me, as somebody who doesn't really play in PvMP and honestly am not the most interested in it, I'm not entirely sure everything that goes on here, but I believe the monster player classes have largely been buffed and just updated. You can read the patch notes and see that, and there have been a whole lot of other general changes. So I encourage you, if you're interested in PvMP, to check that out yourself, because there are really tons of changes here as you see as I scroll down. Otherwise, there are a lot of minor changes, just consistency, language fixes, and various miscellaneous changes here. But that is all we have as far as update 33.2 goes in the Lord of the Rings Online. And as far as the changes go, there are a lot of exciting things. I'm both excited to create a new Dwarden that's going to be really entertaining me trying to play a dwarf, I think, and actually try and stick around with it. I think the Warden class will help with that. And also the Minstrel changes, just very excited to see how that impacts my Minstrel experience, which might be different from others, where I primarily play my Minstrel as a DPS Minstrel more so and just like leveling solo, but even in group content I have sometimes in the past at lower levels, so it'll be interesting to see how all that shakes out with their revamp. Please let me know what you are most excited for, and on that note, I'll wrap up this video, so if you all enjoyed it and learned something useful, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content, and thanks for watching everyone.